Hello. Hello, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures for this webinar entitled Tips for Effective Testimony. My name is Erica McKellar, and I'm with the Fiscal Affairs Program at NCSL, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have any difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in for the audio portion. This webinar will be recorded and archived and available on NCSL's website. You can also download a PDF version of today's webinar slide deck at the top right tab above the PowerPoint. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to type a question in the box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen anytime. Please also share your feedback on this webinar with us with a short survey available at the end of the webinar. If you're not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staff of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. Our overall mission is to strengthen state legislatures. Today's webinar is sponsored by the National Association of Legislative Fiscal Offices, also known as NALFO, one of 9 professional staff associations associated with NCSL. If you are a legislative staff person with fiscal or budget responsibilities, you are automatically a member of NALFO. NALFO plans programming for NCSL's Legislative Summit, which will be held in Indianapolis this August, and also holds a professional development seminar each fall. This year, NALFO is partnering with several other professional staff associations to plan a joint professional development seminar in Atlanta in October. NALFO's work is also highlighted in NCSL's monthly newsletter, The Fiscal Link. If you are interested in learning more about these upcoming meetings or subscribing to the newsletter, please feel free to contact myself or my colleague Savannah Gilmore. Our contact information will be listed at the end of the webinar and is available on our website. Our speaker for today's webinar is Jonathan Ball, Utah's Legislative Fiscal Analyst. Jonathan leads a team of nonpartisan public finance experts who forecast state revenue, recommend budgets, and estimate the cost of proposed legislation. Jonathan has been in public service for over 20 years, serving both the executive and legislative branches of government, and has extensive experience testifying before committees and communicating complex information to legislatures. Jonathan has served on NCSL's Executive Committee and has been president of NALFO and the Western States Legislative Fiscal Officers Association. In 2016, NCSL awarded Jonathan the Stephen D. Gold Award for his commitment to improving the legislative institution and state budgeting practices around the country. With that, I'll turn the program over to Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Welcome, everyone, and good morning, at least here in the West. Good morning. As Erica mentioned, I'm Jonathan Ball. I'm Utah's Legislative Fiscal Analyst, and today we're going to talk a bit about how to be effective communicators in committee meetings. So, nod to yourself privately and earnestly if you've ever felt nervous about public speaking. All right, come on. I know you all have, right? I feel nervous right now, and I feel even more nervous because I just heard Erica say that whatever mistakes I make today will be forever enshrined in NCSL's archives. So no one likes to do this, especially the introverted green eye shade types like us fiscal analysts. But I'm here today to tell you that there is some hope. I'll share with you my top tips for testimony. And hopefully by hearing these from me, you won't be doomed to the same fate. I've learned all of these tips the hard way by making every single one of these mistakes myself. Now, normally, if we were to get together in a room, I would ask you right now to share some of your own horror stories about your own most epic failures in public speaking. But since this is a webinar and it's just me talking to you over the phone, I'll just tell you mine. So here is my most epic fail in presenting to Legislative Committee. It was 22 years ago. It's my first appearance before a committee of the Utah Legislature. And this is probably true in your legislature as well. As with most legislative committees, The legislators are all sitting on a dais, very fancy formal dais in front of a room of interested bystanders. So legislators on the dais, witnesses are presenting from the witness stand, which is sort of in the center of the dais, and then there's the audience that's sitting in the back of this rather large room. And in Utah, the committee staff sits at the dais with the legislators when we make budget presentations. So there I am at the dais, brand new guy in the Utah legislature, and about to make my presentation. I'm sitting next to the chairman and to one of my coworkers. The chair reads my name off the agenda, and I launch in. I got about 3 words into my presentation, and the chair interrupts me and says, Mr. Ball, wouldn't you feel more comfortable at the witness stand? And I'm like, comfortable? I mean, who's ever comfortable in this situation? That's not possible. It doesn't matter where you put me. But I didn't answer that. I answered, no, sir, I'm fine right here. And the chairman said, Mr. Ball, I think you'd be more comfortable at the witness stand. So, it was a pretty clear cue. I packed up my notes, marched myself around the dais, and plopped down at the witness stand, and then I started again. This time I got about 5 words into my presentation, and I looked up, and there were hushed voices coming from the dais, my coworker talking to the chairman. And as I get to my 7th word, the chairman again interrupts me, says, Excuse me, Mr. Ball, excuse me, committee members. Mr. Garriott informs me that Mr. Ball is a new member of our staff. So, Mr. Ball, you're welcome to come back up here and sit with us. So I make the round trip, grab my stuff, go back to my seat, and I launch in. I begin talking about agency budget in question and the agency's executive director, Mr. Peterson. After I said Mr. Peterson about 10 times, the chair interrupted me yet again and said, Mr. Ball, it's Dr. Peterson. So you can imagine at this point I was feeling somewhat sheepish, but somehow I made it to the end of my comments and asked if anyone had questions. When a committee member raised her hand, I pointed at her and said, yes, ma'am, Senator Dayton. And again, the chair interrupted and said, Mr. Ball, please direct all questions and answers through the chair. At which time I slunk down behind the dais, hid my face, and waited for everyone to leave the room. So there are so many things wrong with this story. I really don't know where to start analyzing it. So I will start with my top tips for testimony. Now, alliteration is not among my top tips, but it doesn't hurt. The first top tip is do your homework. Just an aside, what is it with these keep calm signs? I swear to God, they're everywhere now. Now there's even a keep calm sign about doing your homework. In my house, it's actually more appropriate. This sign is actually more appropriate in my house with 3 teenage daughters. Get off your Instagram and do your homework, not keep calm. But I felt like the keep calm one was appropriate for this presentation, the blue one, because doing your homework can actually help you keep calm in this situation. So maybe you should say keep calm by doing your homework instead of and doing your homework. The point is this. Effective legislative presentations, especially in our realm, are backed up by good staff work. Before you got to the presentation phase, you probably have done your research, met with agencies, run your analysis, written your formal report. On top of that, you've written an executive summary, and you put together all your slides. By doing all of those things, you have been preparing for this very moment. And if you spend the right amount of time and energy on those things, that will give you some confidence. All of that backing you up, you shouldn't go wrong. The next tip, practice makes perfect. So it sounds kind of silly, but I think it's true. I prefer to write my presentation longhand, read it to myself, read it out loud to someone else, stand up, close the door, read it out loud as if I'm in front of the committee, and then throw away my notes and read it from memory. And by doing those things, I think I feel better about the presentation itself. I'm ready. I know what comes last. And I think you too, by doing that, would find that all of that practice will make it so that you actually don't need to read your notes. You're going to be prepared to do it just as if it were off the cuff, when we know it's not off the cuff. You put a lot of work and a lot of energy into it. So yeah, practice makes perfect. Close the door, read it out loud, pretend that there's somebody there, read it to your spouse, read it to your friends, read it to whoever will listen. My dog hears a lot of these, and that will get you going, put you in the right place to present in the front of the committee. Oh, sorry, I should have been showing you the slide, I guess, all along. So there are all the steps I just talked through. The next top tip for testimony is come early, stay late. Any Chiefs fans out there? You got to treat these things as if they're like tailgates. Get to know the people before the big event. Get there early, get your place, see what's going on. It'll help you connect with your audience, and it'll give you insights on how your presentation fits into the larger theme of the meeting if you hear the presentations that came before. I've got a great example of this. This was one of those small invitation-only meetings that NCSL puts together, and they had invited me to this meeting to talk about, of all things, fiscal notes. Whew, what an exciting topic. This happened to be a meeting of public and higher education policymakers, and the presentation before mine was an early childhood development researcher who was convinced, and his research showed, that he could tell what a child's career would be before the child entered kindergarten. Of course, committee members found this to be a bit preposterous, and they were getting grumpy with the previous speaker. And of course, then it was my turn, and rather than warming them up for me, in this case, it was the opposite. Here I was facing this angry crowd. But I was able, because I heard the presentation, to break the ice a little bit, and I basically introduced myself saying, Jonathan Ball, Utah's Legislative Fiscal Analyst, and I don't know how I got to become fiscal analyst, but I've wanted to be it ever since we played state legislature in the backyard as kids. Of course, that made everybody laugh, and they were able to at least tolerate my presentation, even if it was about fiscal notes. So getting there a little bit early, hearing the context of the meeting, knowing what came before, that's going to help you out a ton when you're presenting to a committee. Next top tip, know your audience. Look, haters going to hate. You need to be prepared for that by knowing who the haters are in any given situation. Now, some nonpartisan staff officers believe they should avoid politics altogether. I believe the opposite. I believe you have to immerse yourself in politics on all sides of an issue so that you know how your message will be heard when you make a presentation. You don't have to engage in the politics, but you should pay attention. And that's the only way you'll be able to anticipate how your message will be received. For those of you who are younger than 50 years old, these two haters here are Statler and Waldorf, the curmudgeonly old hecklers from The Muppet Show. But I suppose it could be worse. I love this picture. Look at poor Mike Pence there. He's like, Lord Jesus, get me out of here. Mother, you could be Mike Pence. All right, next top tip for testimony. Know your audience, but not too well. So you need to treat our bosses with respect. This, of course, no matter how ridiculous they may be acting, they've earned respect. This is, of course, Elizabeth Warren doing her white man's overbite dance to Aretha Franklin's R-E-S-P-E-C-T. That may look ridiculous, but she is still a U.S. Senator, and you should call her and your bosses by their titles, their formal titles. Never use their first names in a public meeting, no matter how well you know them. And then, of course, if I didn't mention it, I think I did. Always direct questions through the chair, follow procedure, know the procedure in your committee hearings. Next tip, assure that the bosses know you. All right, so, of course, I did that with a slide, right? Here's a funny story about what happens if you don't do it. Always introduce yourself. They probably know who you are, but you never know. Of course, there are thousands of people listening on the internet if you're broadcasting on the internet, so there's always that aspect as well. They can't tell your voice. But sometimes even the legislators in the room don't know who you are. So here's my story about that. We have this sort of sick ritual in Utah. It's hazing almost, where we make brand new financial analysts, within their first few months, they have to do a presentation. And it's not just any presentation, it's a presentation in a public meeting of our Executive Appropriations Committee. And Executive Appropriations Committee, you all probably, that's sort of like our Ways and Means Committee. In Utah, Executive Appropriations Committee is made up of the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the majority and minority leaders of both bodies, the whips, the assistant whips. So all of the elected senior membership in all of the legislature make up this committee of 20 legislators. And new analysts, they have to go present about something to this group within their first 3 months. So a few years ago, we did this, had a new analyst named Zach King, and Zach still works for the legislature, but not here. He works in the auditor's office. Maybe this is why. Zach got up in front of EAC and started presenting about the Attorney General Ombudsman. He didn't introduce himself. He got about, 5 minutes into his presentation about the AG Ombudsman when one member of our leadership he was fed up. He was fed up with the presentation, and he rang in, and the chair recognized him, and this particular legislator says to Zach, "Hey, kid, just cut to the point. What do you want?" That, of course, was a little bit off-putting to poor Zach, and I was able to step in and explain to the committee that Zach here actually works for us. He's on our side. He's one of the good guys. So yeah, he's here just explaining to you the policy situation. That would have gone a lot more smoothly had I or Zach introduced himself or introduced Zach before we launched into the presentation about the Ombudsman. So yeah, do that anyway. It seems a little repetitive sometimes, or maybe not necessary, but it's worth it. I would also say a good way to identify yourself is to leverage your brand. Hopefully you have a brand in your office. Your office has a brand in your legislature. So this is ours, this blue background with the white dome. We always have in a footnote which office of the legislature it's coming from. But these are things like, GAO, the GAO audit. Everybody recognizes a GAO audit because of the cover, right? So if you have a brand, you should use that brand in your presentations, leverage that brand so that whoever you're presenting to, in this case committees, they know who you are just by looking at your slide deck. Okay, so next top tip for testimony is tell them cubed. You've probably heard this one before. I'll have to admit, I kind of hate it, but I think it's true. First of all, you need to understand that people approach problem solving and understanding complex issues differently. If anyone's ever taken a Myers-Briggs personality profile, you know that there are people who start with the big picture at 30,000 feet, and they need to understand the context before they can get to the detail. And then there are people who are just like, they got to hear the detail. They won't be convinced until they do so. And you've got to be able to accommodate both of those personality types. And one really good way to do that is this. Before you get started, you tell them what you're going to tell them. Then, of course, you tell them, right? You go through your slideshow. You present the information. You do all the things that we're talking about today in communicating to a committee member. And then finally, you tell them what you told them. So here's why I hate this. I think sometimes we're way too obvious when we do these kind of things, right? So we put up the first slide says agenda for the day, and it lists all the things we're going to copy, and the last slide says conclusion, and it restates what the first slide said. So my advice to you here is do these things, but just do it a little more subtly. One way that you could do that is this bulleted list that I've been showing you is a really good way to walk through. You might have a timeline in your presentation that you use that advances as you go along. Those are all really good ways to still do all of these things, to make all those personality types feel comfortable without being super, super obvious about what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, number 8, the next top tip for testimony. Tell a story, right? It makes you more personal. It helps them relate to you. This slide has nothing to do with my presentation. That's just kind of how I look in the morning now because we're going to start general session in a couple of weeks. No, I'm just joking. Obviously, this is from Lord of the Rings. This is Gollum. And it wasn't that a great story, right? It had, like, whether you read it when you were a kid in the books or you saw the movies, it's a really good story. It's timeless. It weaves an effective narrative. And that's what you need to do in your testimony. Create a story arc, know where you're going with your presentation, and bring the audience along. And thank you to Matthew Mitchell, who laughed in the audience chat. That's the first time I've gotten feedback. My precious. Yes, very good. Okay, next top tip for testimony, besides tell a story, use anecdotes. All right, listen to Google, people. Some experts, so what does Google say here? An anecdote is a funny little story. An antidote counteracts poison. An anecdote is a memoir soundbite, a little story. They're fun. They don't change your destiny. But antidotes is anti-poison. So dote on situations that require antidotes. Your life may depend on it. Okay, so I'm talking about the former, the anecdote, and not the antidote. But there are experts in sociology who believe that as humans, because we come from a tradition of oral history, folk tales and the like, we remember anecdotes far better than facts. So use that to your advantage. Now, in this case, you're talking to committee members and you're talking about public policy, so your anecdotes have to be supported by the facts that you've uncovered in your homework, but the anecdote itself will help get traction with your audience. I will just say I think auditors and program evaluators do this really well. They'll cover $500,000 worth of fraud in an audit after spending 8 months on site at an office going through every single file. But that $500,000 number is meaningless out of context. they'll find the fraud, but then they'll throw in their report. And these public funds were spent on airport lounge memberships and lingerie, right? And I'm not making that up. If you Google Utah League of Cities and Towns audit, you'll find out that that happened here in Utah. And even though only about $500 of the $500,000 were spent on those two things, the fact that the auditors mentioned them, that caught the attention of policymakers. That made them listen, made them understand that they needed to act, to take action to prevent the larger fraud. Okay, next tip for testimony. A picture paints 1,000 words. Case in point. I mean, these guys are completely innocent, right? Come on, look at that face. How can you stay mad at these guys? And I have no doubt that we all will have our fill of them and their accompanying storyline in the next few weeks. But the picture is all you need. Now, this is what you don't want to do. There's so many things wrong with this. PowerPoint is for making slides, for slide presentations. Word is for writing tomes. Slideshows are supposed to help guide you through your presentation and show pictures. Please don't use slides to write out your speech. At least if you do, put your speech in the speaker's notes and not on the slide. I love this last paragraph here. It says, if you've read this far, your eyes probably hurt and you've been reading this tedious, long-winded text instead of listening to me. I'm insulted. Can't you see I'm doing a presentation up here? Look at me. That's awesome. Stick with the former of these two slides, not the latter. Find a picture, find a way to make it memorable on the slide, and put your text in the speaker's notes, not on the slide. Next tip for testimony: engage your audience. Now, it's not easy in your situation, right? This is you. This is actually Gordon Sondland in the House Intelligence Committee, but this is the situation you're in. There you are, you're standing or sitting at the witness stand or at the dais maybe sometimes, surrounded by elected officials with fancy titles, and it's a very formal situation, and it's not easy to engage your audience. You can't run around among the committee members like you would Phil Donahue and jog around the studio with a wireless mic. I guess Phil Donahue might. If you're under 50, then substitute Kelly Clarkson for Phil Donahue in that example. But so you're not be able to do that. What you can do is you can allow your audience opportunities to ask questions. So in your presentation, think about when you're putting it together where you might want to pause to take questions, to allow them to ask you to clarify. Now, this is not something I typically do. It is not easy to do in a situation like this where you're doing it. I appreciate those of you that are using the chat, though. I am watching. But in a webinar like this one, it's not as easy to take questions. But when you're doing face-to-face in a committee, you can do that. You can just count to 5, count to 7 between slides. Let a little pause for the chairman to recognize a committee member to ask you a question, and that will engage them. I would also say you need to anticipate what questions they might ask you at that point. So when you're putting your pauses into your presentation, maybe write even a few dummy questions for yourself. Okay, and then the last top tip for testimony, and then we're going to see if anybody has questions. I think that Savannah and Erica have been monitoring to see if there are any questions. Last top tip is if you don't know, say so. Say you don't know. This is you in the kayak. That's you presenting your findings, your research, your recommendations. And that big guy behind you, that's the legislature. If you get up in front of them and they ask you a question and you make up an answer, I guarantee you they will smell blood in the water. Like, these guys they've been doing this for a long time, and they usually use that old lawyer's adage, which is never ask a question that you don't know the answer to, or to which you don't know the answer. And so they know what to expect in the answer, and when they get something out of left field, man, they will call you out. So yeah, just if you don't know the answer to a question, just say, I'm sorry, Representative so-and-so or Senator so-and-so, I don't have that answer with me right off the top of my head, but I will be happy to follow up with you and give you a response, and I'll send the response to the whole committee. Right? That's an easy thing to do, and avoids this shark bait situation here. It also, you've got to follow up, right? So you can't just promise that you're going to follow up and not do that. But make yourself a note. Definitely do follow up, and it'll help you learn as you go as well. Okay, so I think that's the last one. We're at minute 30, which leaves a little bit of time for questions. I just have one more slide that I think is really good. Hopefully I've done all of these top tips today in this presentation. Hard to tell on number 11, but I think they will at least get you a long way to feeling comfortable and communicating your point in a committee. This is the last piece of advice. If you do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this slideshow, this is some great advice I once got from a chairman of our Executive Appropriations Committee here in Utah, a guy named Senator Lyle Hilliard. He said to me at one point after a big, long diatribe, "So what?" I really want to know is, so what? What do I need to know about this information? What action are you asking me to take? Why is it important to do? Why should I care? What do I need to do? The so what of this presentation is our bosses are very busy people, and we're lucky to get 5 minutes with them, let alone an audience with them. So let's use that time wisely by being prepared and having in mind an end game for them. So that's it on my formal presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you, Jonathan. If you have any questions for Jonathan, please type them into the audience chat box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And Jonathan, I'll go ahead and kick one off really quickly. If staff have to give presentations or testimony with limited access to technology, if they aren't able to use slides, do you have any particular tips for preparing for that kind of scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So my rule of thumb is I always bring paper. So you don't have to have your entire slide deck printed for every member of the committee, but it is helpful to have a one-pager that summarizes your top points, and you can pass that around. You can then have your own slideshow printed out with your speaker's notes on it to remember what you were going to say, how you're going to say it, to help guide that presentation. But nowadays, things are getting better, right? I mean, it used to be just horrible. You never knew whether there would even be a projector in a room, let alone if you could connect to it with whatever device you had. Things are getting better now. It's pretty regular that there will be technology in a room, that there will be converters for your laptop. But I do always bring along something in physical form, just a short one-pager that hits those highlights. It roughly follows the presentation. That's a nice takeaway for the audience as well, right? So they don't have to necessarily go back to your slide deck. My favorite part is when audience members take pictures of your slide deck while you're presenting it. I think that's hilarious. You could also always just email your slide deck to everyone individually.
Thank you. We have another question. What do you do if you have a complete blackout and don't remember anything in the moment? Any ideas on how to protect yourself there?
Yeah, same thing. Just make sure. That's why I would say you've got your speaker's notes with your slide deck. That'll help you. I guess you don't want to read your notes, but if that's your only alternative, there it is in front of you. That's part of the being prepared part, right? Kind of half joking about throwing away your presentation. You don't actually throw it away. You just don't need to look at it as much. But if you do, if you do completely black out, A, have someone call a paramedic. B, once you're able to recover, then just look at your speaker notes in your slide deck.
Great. And one of the audience members just shared another good tip of remembering to bring your business cards with you and being willing to share information after the fact with committee members. We have another question. Would you advise not using social media in relation to the hearing and saving it for after or during or before?
Yeah, so it does make sense. We sort of have a policy on how that works in our legislature. We really only post or tweet formal stuff, and most of it's automated, so it comes from a database, so their auto tweets is not something that we do individually. As nonpartisan staff members, we sort of avoid social media anyway, at least in our professional life. But I think it's a good idea to wait until presentation is done or the committee hearing is done. Either do it before or after rather than during. It's a distraction anyway. Everybody else will be posting during your presentation. So I suppose if you have someone that can help you with your social media who could post on your behalf, that might be one way to do it. But here in Utah, we just do the auto tweets and auto posting before and after the committee hearing and not during.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Any thoughts on how to handle those moments when your findings may contradict the opinions or positions of legislators? Oh,
yeah. All right, that's from Jake Dinsdale, who's an auditor here in Utah. And Jake, you can tell Zach that I told his funny story about getting Dougaled by John Dougal. So Jake, you guys face this all the time in the auditor's office, and that I think it goes back to knowing your audience and what to expect. Really, it boils down to, first of all, knowing that they're going to react negatively to your findings or your recommendations, but then just explaining to them your logic and reminding them, this is something I do often, reminding folks, legislators, that we're nonpartisan staff, we avoid bias wherever we can, but we have data that backs up the particular position that we're talking about. Usually I find if you explain it in those terms and you provide them the detail, they'll at least, if nothing else, they'll respect the presentation you've made, the position that you've taken. Never, ever argue with them. That's the bottom line.
Thanks. Next question, do you have any recommendations about incorporating constituents into your testimony, how to brief them, et cetera?
Oh, wow, that's a really, really good question. I think some important things for them would be have them come up to the Capitol beforehand, like on a non-committee day, right? Sometimes just visualizing the room is helpful for them. That will help them reduce anxiety. So have them come up and sit in the witness chair so they know the feeling. Talk to them about your rules of your committee, what is it that is expected? Things like, always directing answers through the chair, questions and answers through the chair, and helping, maybe be one of those people that they practice in front of. Of course, also always share what you're going to say so that they know where they fit in. And this bit that I've already talked about, which is, treating people with respect. Look, you might not agree with all legislators, and they might not as well. The constituents might not. And I think that it's important to remind folks that legislators, state legislators, they're not getting rich and famous by being in the state legislature. They're usually doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they care deeply about something, or they have a position about something that motivates them. You don't have to agree with their position or with that something that they care deeply about, but you do. I think it's important to respect the fact that they're doing it with the right motives.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. Any last questions for Jonathan before we wrap up the webinar? All right. With that, we will wrap up this webinar. If you have any questions following the event, please feel free to contact us at the email addresses shown on the screen. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. Lastly, please take a moment to share your feedback on this webinar by taking a short survey after it concludes. Thank you very much to Jonathan Ball for his presentation, and thank you for participating in this webinar today.